Thank you for joining us for this debate that is accompanying the opening of a solo exhibition titled 2.8B420K by Andy Gracie, who's the artist and the author of the project and the show. Andy is an artist that works within various disciplines such as installation, robotics, sound, video, and biology. And in his work, he's interested in the ways and tools people use to imagine, simulate, and inhabit scenarios that test our understanding and imagining of the future. His projects are a lot of times concerned with the psychology, culture, and aesthetics of catastrophe and the status of humanity on a cosmic scale. And this deep time perspective is characteristic also of this project that he's showing at Osmosa, the project that we'll of course talk about a little bit more in the following hour. The title 2.8B420K sets a deadline or let's say a premiere for the project in a way, which will happen 2.8 billion years from now, when the average global temperature on Earth will reach 420 kelvins or 147 Celsius, which is actually the point or the condition in which even the final vestiges of life, which will be by then simple sub-terrestrial microbes, will become extinct. The project proposes a monument known as the Object to commemorate this transition from the biological to post-biological and to mark the end of all life on Earth. And maybe before I invite Andy to just say a couple of words about the project, maybe just like a little bit more before we delve into the questions and the opinions of our participants. Of course, I would like to present our guests as well. So Beti Žerovc is an art historian, art theorist, and researcher in the areas of visual art, the art system since the mid-19th century, and public monuments in the territory of former Yugoslavia, with a focus on the role in society. She's also the author of a book, When Attitudes Become the Norm, the contemporary curator and institutional art. On Zoom is joining us Matthew Wolf-Meyer, who is a researcher at the Institute for Advanced Studies at Temple University and member of the Faculty of Social Sciences, and his second book, Theory for the World to Come, Speculative Fiction and Apocalyptic Anthropology, is an autoethnographic exploration of speculative fiction as a source of social theory in the context of global and local catastrophes. Rok Brajkovič, a university-educated geologist who's employed at the Geological Survey of Slovenia, where he researches former environments that have disappeared in deep geological time, and Blaž Vičič, who is a geologist who earned his PhD at the University of Trieste and continued then his research of earthquakes at the International Center for Theoretical Physics in Miramare, and has also a strong passion for geophysical phenomena as well as more down-to-the-ground geology like minerals and rocks, and often also participates in citizen science projects. What is important to mention is that all of our guests have been consulting or have been consultants for Andy while he researched for this project. So they all are somehow familiar already, at least with the first stages of the project, and I'm really happy that we can host them here today and talk a little bit more about the whole thing. So maybe Andy, you can say a couple of words about the project if you prepared an introduction, otherwise we can just go straight forward to the questions.
I will say I don't have anything prepared, some notes that I don't even understand anymore. So I'm gonna. But firstly, I want to thank Beti and Rok and Blaž and Matthew. I can't see you, but I know you're there. The generosity of all these people and other people who aren't here, Nuria Lorca Isan in Barcelona, Material Sciences, and other people as well, that have added such a richness to the project and have made a project which is so intangible, have miraculously made it almost tangible with the generosity of their knowledge. And to Tjaša and Uros for supporting the whole thing, Marco for having the crazy idea of wanting to work with me in the first place on this stuff. So this project, this is 2.8B420K. It's the latest in a series of projects which are under the umbrella called the Haunting series. And this one, I think, is the most kind of literal representation of what was not the inspiration, but the motivation to make this work. And I'll briefly talk about this thing if you haven't read the paper already. So when I was a small child, from the ages of about 6 to 10, maybe, I used to have this recurring vision, but it wasn't a vision, it wasn't a hallucination, and it wasn't a fever dream. It was just this sudden, incredibly lucid awareness of the presence of two huge and infinitely massive dark spheres. And these two huge, massive spheres were connected by a really, really fine thread. And the spheres were really pulling apart at like sub-tectonic speeds. And if that thread were to break, then that would then unleash all the horrors and nightmares and darkest meta-realities that humanity in its darkest moments could actually conjure up. So I was talking to this about a good friend of mine, Kira O'Reilly, who some of you might know. She's a really amazing artist. And she said to me, well, you need to make work about that, don't you? And anyone that knows Kira will know exactly the tone of voice. I was like, she's completely right. And in the 3 years since she said that to me, I've been obsessing about the idea of these spheres and kind of reliving a lot of that horror that I used to feel about them. So anyway, the Haunting series is all about this idea of catastrophe that's represented by the separation of these spheres, and I think is actually really topic with new realities and paradigms that we're becoming aware of at the moment. And yeah, so this monument, I wanted to make a work about deep time, another work about deep future, about how things come to an end. And I wanted to make a monument to that kind of paradigm shift, that transition of Earth from a biological to a post-biological entity. A moment that nothing will witness. But I think this is such a vital transition. It's so fundamental to everything we know about life and the only life in the universe that we know of. When that comes to an end, something has to be done. Something has to mark that moment. And so that's where this project came from. And it's about this idea that while life exists, the monument holds the spheres. They can't separate, they can't fall because the monument is sustaining them. But within the component that connects the spheres, there's a polymer which I've been developing with Núria Cern at the University of Barcelona. This polymer deforms and weakens at exactly 147 Celsius. At the moment the temperature reaches that which kills the last life, the component fails, the spheres are separated and fall to Earth. And that really simple symbolic action commemorates the transition from biological to post-biological. The balls have fallen to the Earth. All the darkest horrors can now be unleashed because nothing is left to suffer them. And that was kind of the fundamental idea behind the project. And also about these more ideas about how we relate to deep time, creating a visual representation now, something huge and tangible that connects a thread that insists that we project ourselves into the deep future, that we consider this, what we perceive as a permanent moment, that we are forced to consider that as a moment of impermanence on a very, very long thread of time which stretches deep, deep into a future that we can hardly imagine. And yeah, I guess, I don't know, I could, this idea, as kind of humanity, we're a very, it's a hugely egotistical, I mean, like a white male artist creating a huge structure is kind of cliche, but it's representative of this desire we have to make monuments, to convey meaning, to mark moments, to project ourselves into this thing. And it's kind of, I thought, okay, I'm unashamedly going to engage with that. It's okay, because I think that creating a monument to the end of our life is really the most important project that humanity can undertake. And despite the the huge need of resources and budget and economics that you need to build a thing, I'm completely convinced that it has to be done anyway, which is why it was really important that people working in the fields of geology, cultural history, speculative anthropology and material sciences could help me to come up with these ideas about how we can actually make this ridiculous idea a reality.
That's a great start for the first question. Maybe for Beti, because I see that she has maybe some opinions on it. What I would like to ask first, Beti and Matthew, when you were talking with Andy about this project over Zoom beforehand, why, if at all, what parts of it did you find interesting in terms of why would such a seemingly impossible task as building an object that would outlive not just our generations but all of humanity, now as Andy explained, his vision, even on all life on Earth would be relevant? Or why is it interesting to think about such a project today?
Actually, you asked me, you invited me to meet with Andy. I guess most of you, know at least a little bit what I'm doing. I'm an art historian. Mostly I work on the late 19th century, then on late 20th century and contemporary art like curatorship. But one of the topics that was my main preoccupation in the last years were monuments. Actually, I was researching now for the last 4 or 5 years the monuments of ex-Yugoslavia, in the sense, what was their role in the state of Yugoslavia when it was existing? Did they have an active role in that? And did they have maybe an active role also in the country of Yugoslavia falling apart? So that means that, yes, I was researching that, and I didn't find an answer that I was searching for, and that I'm still searching for, on what kind of creature exactly the monument is. What is the monument doing? What are its effects? So actually, anybody who is thinking about that, especially in such an intense way as Andy was doing that with this project, is interesting for me. As somebody who is trying to understand the monument, its logic, what to do it, why to do it. So that's why it was. The story of this monument was interesting for me. I don't believe in monuments. I think they should not be built. Actually, after all these years of researching of the role of the monuments in ex-Yugoslavia, I'm very much against the phenomenon of monument being built at all. I think we should keep what stayed after Yugoslavia and also the recent monuments, but I would be really happy if we would, let's say, make an embargo for 10 or 20 years in building all kinds of monuments and such stuff in public space. His monument, in a way, it was not nonsensical for me or a bad idea, because it was as an idea to make such kind of a monument. I think it's a great, a very effective mean to make us think about our future, of what is important, not just in a sense, this is kind of a memento mori, everything has to pass, but to really think, okay, the things like states, like ideologies, that will finish at some certain point. So what's the point in such kind of a monument? I think, all those things that this project makes you reflect are really important for us. So for me, it was it was very attractive. I like talking to you, and I like the idea. Yeah.
And maybe a follow-up question before I give the word to Matthew, because you research the history of monuments and knowing or researching their role in society and the context in which they were built and then maybe also dismantled. Is there like any examples of monuments that were made to somehow commemorate future events? Because like this monument that Andy is proposing is a bit different to the ones that are, you know, placed in memory of something that has passed, so that we could remember either the good or the bad parts of history. This one is actually commemorating something that none of us will ever be able to live through. So I know that of course these kind of monuments, I imagine, don't exist in the world, but are there models or examples of monuments that were built with the idea of the future in mind, even if that was like a short-term future, just like a future that is yet to come, or a community that is the monument supposed to evoke?
Such kinds of things, some I probably don't know, but yeah, such kinds of examples do exist, yes. But the problem here is that, you know, to explain such kind of things, a longer explanation would be needed. We are now, we here at Andy's project, it's a project that's happening in the art system. The monuments are usually not something that is so much connected to the art systems, but they are very practical, very utilitarian objects. They are usually built by the communities because they want to do something with them. Something very political. That's also why monuments usually, if a political system changes, you know, they erase what it's not to their liking, they build the new ones. So that means that usually monument would be something that is very practical, so it's not to reflect on something in the future, something so utopian, because such kind of monument would be a product of the art system. Yeah? And usually now you have communities that build them because they want something with them, because they want to educate, to tell, I don't know, we Slovenes, we live here, not you Austrians or Germans or something. Something like that. And to do that, they would usually take something from the past. This is our poet, this is our great or our sad moment. So when we are speaking about monuments, we would, speak about culture of remembrance and all kinds of things. So usually it is very deeply connected usually with the past. No? Mm-hmm. It's commemorating something, you know, because if it's monuments, it's usually that. Otherwise, it's a public sculpture. No? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And maybe here, where you mentioned, like, actually this monument that Andy is proposing is a speculative one. So somehow, of course, the memento mori part of it, it's present throughout the history of this planet since life existed. Like, there are species going extinct all the time, right? So somehow it is related to the past. So there is a fact that we know that everything somehow dies, right? But at the same time, it also is based on a very, maybe even universalist ground, that not just there is a community based on like tied, connected through political, cultural, or whatever kind of identity that they share. It's not even like a community of humans in terms of the species, it's a planetary community of all beings. So somehow the monument, in a way, it's like, it's not very concrete. You cannot really, like, you know, what this universalist basis actually mean for the community that the monument should address, or the community that should take care of this monument. So I wanted to ask Matthew actually, because as I mentioned, you wrote a book that deals also with speculative fiction and the questions of the world to come and so on. And you also did an interview with Andy for the book that is also shown in the exhibition. How would you reply, or what are your thoughts on this part of the project?
Sure. So I think the initial appeal of the project is kind of the perversity of it. I'm drawn toward perverse things, and the idea of having a monument for the end of life on Earth was something that kind of tickled that part of me. And I too thought about like monuments for the future rather than for the past. And as a kind of project, just on its face, that seems like a really compelling, way to get people to think about the future. And that book that you mentioned, Theory for the World to Come, the heart of it is really trying to develop ways to get people to think differently about how they think about the future. And if you look at the conversation that Andy and I have, it's really about thinking about like, how do we iterate different possibilities for the future, and how might a monument like this change the way we think about possibilities. One of the things that like I kept falling back on was the monument as like the end of human life, which was my own sort of narcissism being projected onto the monument. And Andy had to correct me over and over again that it was not all life on Earth. But that movement, I think, was really about like trying to reframe what the scale of the future is, right? That like in our kind of anthropogenic moment, we're really thinking about the end of human life, or the end of human life as we know it. And a project like this just totally changes the conversation, right? It changes the scale of how we're thinking about our relationship to the planet and our relationship to other species, and like how all of that is dwarfed by these much more like cosmic level shifts in temporality and the experience of an environment. So all of that was like, I was really compelled by the project of working through those problems and thinking about them from the kind of like the social side, and what doing a thing like this does to our present. How does it change the way that we relate to one another and to our planet? And what does it do in order to like inaugurate different kinds of futures?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It's actually, that's why it's a speculative project in a way that it actually opens up multiple different possibilities of future realities in which the human community in a global scale would need to come together in one impossible task, and not just agree on actually building this, but also develop tools and techniques and technologies and materials that this kind of monument could actually survive until the moment in time in 2.8 billion years when it actually can perform this gesture, this first and final commemoration of the ultimate extinction of life on the planet, but also at the same time how to provide the rituals of care that will actually guarantee that that the future generations don't destroy the object, they don't like throw it away or repurpose it or something like that. In that sense, it's the first layer would be the questions that relate to the change of meaning and interpretation of this object, right? So it has a certain message now that you assigned to it, that wanted to bear, Andy. But at the same time, we know that already in our lifetime, the meaning might change and probably will. So how do you actually guarantee the meaning of an object through, time? Of course, we know objects that are materially preserved from history, from ancient civilizations, but at the same time they don't mean the same thing to us as we don't use them in the same way and so on. So maybe Beti, being an art historian, I know that on these time scales, of course it's totally like impossible to think about it, but what are certain practices or rituals that maybe today we use to try to preserve meanings of objects for future generations?
Monument is usually a part of a larger system where you have similar monuments and where you have the ideology that is behind those monuments. So you have a story. So you usually know what a monument stands for, let's say in one city, and the same meaning could be repeated in another city and so on. So usually the meaning doesn't mean that you have just one object and you understand what this is for. That would be a logic that you would have in an art project or in a public sculpture or something like that. If you have monuments, they would be in a structure and meaning would be provided through the structure. Usually that would mean also other layers, that the same story would be taught in school, that the same story would be, supported also by rituals that would happen on a certain days with, somebody was killed or blah, blah, blah. So, I don't know. So the similar monument would be usually in such kind of a state political system, which is a similar system as an art system or church system or whatever. Mm. So if you have a monument as Andy's, first you have a problem to fix the meaning at all. You will have to find some kind of a way that that the people will understand what is this monument about. And if now you decided for some kind of form of the monument, the form doesn't speak for itself. It's suspiciously similar also to the forms that we know from the Yugoslav monuments, which are kind of nice abstract forms, but that means that they are very incapable to transfer meaning. No? I'm not sure how to fixate the meaning if you want to have something as a monument and not something as an art project. And if you don't have this structure, which also has then rituals that go with it, I'm also not sure how to do the perpetuation towards the future. So I think these are all the things that you have to maybe still think about.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. I think this is where we kind of get this friction, we have this strange territory. That the thing is, by the scale, I mean, the proposed scale for this is like between 50 to 100 meters tall. It's huge, because it has to be. You would see this. This is a monument. There's nothing else you could call it. And so all our kind of cultural frames of reference for a monument talk to us about all these ideas that you're telling us is what monuments do. Monuments mean something, they commemorate something. And yes, we need to maintain meaning into the future. And something me and Matthew spoke about it as well in the interview, about how all these failed attempts that we've made to both interpret information from the past and also how to project information into the future, the different strategies that have been tried, and that storytelling, kind of community caring for an idea seems to be the best way to transport things into the future. At the same time, it's a monument that's not a monument. It's not a monument that shares the purpose of monuments. So does it need to abide by the same rules as monuments? And it's a monument that doesn't have a meaning, it's a monument that has a purpose. It's an object that waits, and it's waiting, so it's kind of a tool. It's a functional tool as much as it is a representational monument. And its only task is to wait and to bear witness while things are happening, and to wait and then to perform his thing. And so really the reason why I was so interested in talking to people like yourself and Matthew was about that we'll come to the logistics later with Rok and Blaž, but apart from the logistics about how do you actually make it, the thing is it's made by humans and it will outlive humans. And so it actually becomes a really rich symbol for humans, despite the fact that it doesn't have this big meaning within it. Humanity, I'm interested in the way that humanity would attach meanings to it. And how once such a construction has been forgotten, thousands of years into the future, how humanity would evolve its own understanding of it, and what kind of society grows around it in terms of its maintenance, how it's regarded, whether it's detested, whether it's loved, whether it becomes celebrated in different ways. And these are were the kind of areas that I was really interested in exploring.
Matthew, maybe you can also share some thoughts on this because you were speaking with Andy in the interview about it. Maybe are there any examples in speculative fiction literature of stories that describe communities that somehow deal with this problem? I mean, the first one that came to mind was for me the trilogy Death's End by Liu Cixin, where there's this whole planet dedicated for preserving artworks from humanity.
It's mentioned in the book.
Yeah, exactly. And then it nevertheless gets, destroyed. I won't spoil no spoilers, read the book, it's amazing. But so yeah, Matthew, do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, one of the things that Andy and I talked about was the possibility of having some kind of Rosetta Stone as part of the monument so that it has some way for people to decode it in the future built into it, right? And that, and we talked about the Voyager panels and other attempts to kind of create sign systems that, are mobile and that other people with, or people, aliens, whatever, have some way to decipher our code in order to understand what the message is. And, but beyond that, I'm not sure. I mean, we talked a lot about how, monuments change in their meaning over time, and the way that people relate to them are unpredictable. And it can vary from people being totally indifferent to them to being very upset about them or being very interested in them. And that, it's likely in the life course of any monument that it will evoke a variety of those feelings, right? And that, you can't really predict it or maintain it. That there might be ways to slow the interpretive possibilities around it, but they're going to drift over time. It's just the nature of something that's going to be around for a long time. The only thing that immediately came to mind in terms of thinking about the kind of interpretable flexibility of a thing is Dan Simmons' Hyperion books, which aren't about a monument or a thing so much as they are about an entity that appears across space and across time and has these interactions with different people and is a total cipher. And so in every case, people bring their different interpretive schemes to understanding what this thing is. But that, I don't know. I'm going to have to think about it, what the other possibilities are in literature for something that's analogous to this.
But did you, when speaking and thinking about it with Andy and thinking about this project, did you perceive or understood this monument as an object that's related to something catastrophic, extinction as something that is terrible, dramatic, like horror, or is it something that is to be celebrated in a way? Is it like a celebratory gesture? Because you could have a community that celebrates death somehow, and even if it's not, through reincarnation or something like that. So what kind of a community that would actually want to build this monument and would invest resources and energy and generations into preserving it, they would somehow need to either appreciate or fear the end of all life on Earth. So Matthew, do you understand it in which way do you understand it?
So I think came down a little differently and would be really happy to be corrected about it. But I kind of thought that, like, in many respects, the best effective relationship to the monument was like a careful indifference, that like it really is just a thing. And it's kind of like having a relationship with an enormous clock, you know, like it is going to do the thing that it's going to do. And people's responsibility is basically to maintain it so that it can do that thing. So that there's kind of like a caretaking element to the relationship to it. But in a lot of ways, like not having strong, effective relations to it is maybe a positive thing. Because one of the things that Andy and I talked about was like, maybe a lot of people will be really angry about it because it's like accused, or they see it as accusatory, or maybe people will be really like interested in capitalizing upon it as a symbol in some way. And like that might be productive in particular ways, but it might also be kind of detrimental to the mission of the object in some sense. So like maybe calculated indifference is a good thing with something like this.
I should add at this moment that the something about the visibility of the monument to humanity while it exists, and something which we'll cover when we get into the how to protect it from geological forces. That there's this idea that in the practicality to create an object that can endure for billions of years is, you know, I think that entire mountain ranges will have a lifespan of tens or hundreds of millions of years, and we're talking about, you know, powers of 10 times that, 100 times that. So to have the object exposed for this amount of time, it's just not going to work. It needs to be protected. So through conversation with Rok and Blaž, we came up together with this idea, through thinking through the problem about this. It has a geological sarcophagus, so it's deep underground, like in these kind of open mines, to resist the forces of surface erosion, and it's within a huge protective mountain to resist the forces of other erosion in glaciers and all these kind of things. So it's protected. So, and this protection hopefully would last for between 100 million years and 500 million years, by which time it's highly likely that humanity is not even there anymore. So for the time which humanity coexists with the monument, the only way to see it is to make an effort to go to the mountain and enter the mountain and go down and actually see it. So it would be very easy to be indifferent because you just go, that's a mountain. It would be a very easy thing to ignore. So maybe only the most interested people would make almost like a pilgrimage to actually go to the mountain, go down into the depths of the earth to actually see the object face to face. And then we had this old idea as well that the thing would be built within a capitalist system. So, you know, how you protect, you know, maybe there's like a souvenir shop at the entrance to the mountain, so people are engaging with it in that kind of commercial way that we're so kind of familiar with.
No, but first, who is building that monument?
Yeah.
Who? Which community? Who is building the monument? I guess that is something that
this is something else that we talked about, and kind of Matthew had this really nice idea about the monument is actually, because the ownership becomes really problematic. Who does it belong to? So Matthew had this idea that it's actually built as a gift, that a nation or an entity, and how you define this entity as a city, a nation, a tribe, a community of some sort, would build it as a gift to the rest of humanity or to another demographic entity of some kind, which I thought was a really interesting perspective. But then, yeah, it's, you know, I have this kind of utopian idea that it's a project performed by humanity on the same kind of scale that would be necessary when we talk about how do we save humanity. We build these huge spaceships, we all float up into space. Would also be a project built on the scale of humanity, and I think this monument is important enough as well that humanity comes together to build a monument. It's the only way. So it's ours. We build it. It belongs to us.
But now that we touched upon the questions of material preservation of the monument, even after humanity does not exist on the planet anymore. So these are now questions for Rok and Blaž, because like now in the era of Anthropocene, right, like an ecological catastrophe that the human impact on the planet environment created, we're actually always now talking about how to make our imprint on the planet smaller, right? So, but here the question is like reverse. So how to actually make our mark forever in our time scale? Like, of course, it's not forever ever, but like for us, it's a kind of forever. There will be no more humans left. So in a way, we were talking about the meaning, how it's like changes, but even on a material scale, on a material level, in such deep time, such deep future, it might be that no traces, even unintentional ones, will be left of our existence. I listened to one podcast that I can't remember now where it was. I think it was Unexplainable Podcast or something like that. And they talked about the aliens from the past in terms of there could be some civilizations or like life forms before us, not necessarily intelligent, because we know that life restarted several times on the planet, and we don't have any material traces of them. Of course, even the technologies we now have and the plastics in such long time scales, it will be gone. So somehow, from a geological perspective, how to plan for such a project that actually wants to survive 2.8 billion years?
Okay, so maybe I just make a short introduction, and then we will divide it into two sectors. So, firstly, I would like to say that thinking about millions and billions is really hard. You cannot imagine, probably most of you thinking of such long time scales is for most people nearly impossible. But in our field, we are working with an error of couple of million years, and that's within the 95% of confidence. So working with Andy and on this project has kind of given us a bit of a larger time frame than usual, but not such a larger one that we are used to. And maybe now for Blaž to take over and explain some of his parts, because he's working more of a deep structure, and then I can take over.
Okay, so yes, first I would like to touch what you already said. I mean, the imprint we are doing on the planet Earth is currently, I would say, really not enough to be something observable in 2.8 billion years. I mean, we exist for last 100,000 years, and what we are doing to the environment, this is last 2,000 years, and if we find a fossil of a dinosaur, this is 1 in a billion find. I mean, a million dinosaurs needs to die to find one fossil. So it's very we are not there yet to make a long-term fingerprint. Okay, so how we start to work with Andy? Basically, we told him how the planet Earth, how the surface of the planet Earth is developing through time. So we became interested in what will happen in 2.8 billion years from today, how the world will be shaped, what we will see, what will be the surface, what will not be the surface anymore. And well, it was after a few minutes of discussion, we realized that this is actually a very complicated discussion. I mean, the results will not be so simple. So the biggest problem is that, the world is even though we know it as a solid thing that is not really changing, when we look in the millions years, billion years, it's almost a fluid. I mean, everything is moving around. What was once continent is done today down at almost at the core of the earth, so everything is moving strongly. And also the oldest rocks today, what we think are the oldest rocks today are around 4 billion years old. And this does not mean that this was the surface that you could walk. I mean, this was just a small fragment of a rock that was reworked, moved around, eroded, made a rock again, eroded again, that we were able to find and date. So it's very hard to imagine what actually will happen. So how we started, we took some numerical models of how the tectonic plates will move. The plates are spreading apart, they're going together, they're subducting one beneath the other. And we took some numerical models for the next, how much was it? 1 point something billion years.
Billion years.
So after that, we are completely blind. And as Rok said before, even this in 1.3 billion of years, margin of error is really big. So these are just some ideas how tectonic plates will move. So we took these models and then took our knowledge of physical and chemical processes that take place, shaping the Earth's crust and the deeper interior of the Earth. And we tried to play a bit, trying to figure out where are those interesting areas. So the first step was to identify, okay, should we put our monument in the middle of a plate that did not change in the last couple of billions of years, even though it did, because the erosion rate is removing material quite fast in geological time scale. And then we decided it's better to move it underground, at least give it some protection against erosion. And
which was the location that you determined as the potentially most viable one?
We never actually came to agreement about that. We were talking about these, like you're saying, the middle of the plates, there's these areas called cratons, which, like you're saying, is where we find the oldest rock. But again, I was under the impression before I was speaking to people that know what they're talking about, that these cratons had been the surface for all this time. But no, it's not, because the surface is removed really quickly, like you're saying. So we were thinking cratons, and there's ideas of cratons, and I was thinking of what I've actually written in the book is that Australia is the place, the center of Australia.
We should move there if we want to survive the tectonic dynamics.
Australia won't be Australia forever. But this is what appeared to be amongst the cratons would be the...
So we will have Uluru and some kilometers further your monument.
To go and visit it, yeah, it's feasible.
So it's cheaper than
a lot bigger than
it will be a lot bigger than Uluru is more. Yeah, it will be much bigger.
I hope, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
The mountain.
So, what's from the geological perspective, which planetary factor is the most problematic one for the permanence of this monument, of this object? Which is the one that the biggest obstacle to actually survive the deep time scale?
Yeah, in my view, that would be the formation of landscapes. So we are looking now at a landscape that formed, the oldest hills or mountains that we look started to form around 15 million ago. Just small hills like that, and the really landscape that we observe now in geological time came to be in recent really recent times. So predicting it, how the landscape will form in 2.8 billions on this location that Andy chose, it's in my view the hardest, because there is one sad thing that can happen maybe if it is if the landscape is formed in a way that it forms a sedimentary basin, so that rocks are transported into this area, it can cover this. And then when we came to the time of the 2.8 billions, it won't be on the surface and it cannot be seen.
So it actually needs, well, it won't be seen anyway, because everything will die by then. That's what we expect, unless something manages to survive. But so the monument should actually, so what's the process? So it's under this mountain, then the erosion kind of eats away the mountain, then there's a certain dome that you said, like some black diamond dome, that then gets eroded as well, and then the monument actually needs to be on the surface to be able to meet the conditions for its performance. Or
Rok and Blaž would be able to talk a lot more accurately about what, if these would be concurrent processes or not, but that's the idea. There's two strategies. One is that there's the protective mountain, which would have to be made of the most erosion-resistant rock, and we talked about even finding, as the climate changes, trying to calculate.
And which one is it? I mean, which one you speculate?
There is no straight answer, because what Andy was getting to, I mean, the climate is changing, and what is really erodable today might not be really erodable tomorrow. So let's say where we live now, limestone is eroded quite fast with chemical processes, but some rocks are eroded slowly. But you change the acidity in the atmosphere, and some other rocks will become more erodable. So not only that we would have to know these geological processes, we would also have to have a really good model for the atmosphere for the next millions of years, which is, in my opinion, even harder. I mean, we are not able to get a good weather forecast for next week. How will we do it for 1 billion years from now?
So some further research is required to design the composition of the mountain, but effectively it's a mountain designed to withstand several hundred years of erosion, ideally. It may be less, it may be more, depends how it's constructed or what other non-natural materials are incorporated there. I was talking a lot with the material scientists about these incredible ceramics we have now that are incredibly resistant to erosion, things like this, which I proposed for the main structure. But basically, there's the mountain. The mountain over tens, hundreds of millions of years erodes away. And this is why it needs a big budget, because then there's a protective dome made of diamond, made of carbon, which is black diamond, which is, we know diamond's pretty tough. Black diamond's huge, 100-meter dome of black diamond. And so that will take as well a long, long time to finally erode away. It will erode away. And so there's that process. The kind of surface erosion, or I also chose Australia because Australia will be least prone to future ice ages, which was to factor in. But if it's in a more northern continent, the whole thing could be wiped out by a glacier in really short amount of time. So there's the craton, which is least susceptible to glaciation, is going to be the Australian cratons. And then to resist the surface erosion processes, that's why it's underground in this huge pit, because the idea is, and I'm convinced it's not as simple, that Rok would surely be able to explain, that as the surface is eroded away, the platform underground that the thing is built on effectively is raised up to the surface. But then there's also, it's not that simple, because as erosion happens from the top, uplift happens from underneath, and it's, things are floating around and become buoyant, less buoyant, lighter, heavier, and things are moving around a lot. So It's a challenge, right?
Right, but
But this is the basic principle. It still needs work.
yeah, but Andy, you could open a new scientific field with your questions. So
Yeah, let's do that.
yeah.
But which tools did you use? Which tools are used to try to determine the future landscape of the planet? I mean, is it computer simulation? Is that like even a useful tool or not? AI or something else entirely? What do you use to actually speculate about the arrangement of continents so far in the future?
So he's your continent guy.
Yeah.
Fantasy. It's fantasy. So no AI. It's science fiction. No, but as I mentioned before, so we borrowed a model, a numerical model. So today we can measure deformation of the Earth as a body. We know which direction one plate is moving, which direction is the other one moving, what's going on underground. So there are multiple models, numerical model calculated so you can see how the continents were shaped, were moving around in the past, as well as you can project this to the future. But as I mentioned before, this is limited with our knowledge. So we currently know, okay, today this and this process, the physical processes that are acting on the Earth's crust are the most important. But if you make the mantle in the Earth a bit more rigid than it is, then these processes will all change. And there are so many variables that you have to take care of, that it's these future projections are very very bad actually.
But there are there's two quite important phenomena which will happen, which we don't know when and how long will take, and they are that eventually the tectonic activity will stop, that the plates will become finally fixed in a position, and the date when that happened is been quite strongly debated recently, right? That's one thing, and the other thing that happens is the evaporation of the oceans. The evaporation of the oceans will have an effect on, as a lubricant for the tectonic activity, and also because once as the oceans evaporate, water vapor is always evaporated. When the water vapor reaches the stratosphere, the hydrogen and the oxygen atoms become separated. The hydrogen is lost into space, and the oxygen falls back to Earth. So the atmosphere will become, when the oceans completely evaporate, which they will, the hydrogen gets lost, and suddenly there's huge amounts of oxygen, which then gets locked into the rocks. This affects the climate as well. The lack of tectonic activity also affects other geological processes. The fact that there's no plant life anymore means that there's nothing to bind the substance of the Earth together, which is why we get this kind of oxidized red desert deep into the future, which is the kind of landscape concept that this whole thing is based in. But when these things happen and how long they take, we don't really know yet, right?
I mean, there are these.
For this protective dome, the layered structure, actually we could calculate the amount of the erosion. So geologists use really simple method in this. So we construct a block of some typical rock, and then measure it how it dissolves through time, and basically we can use this to interpolate it into the future, and
so like physically you make a test and like just speed up the process of erosion. Cool.
He should mention how fast.
For the limestones we know it's a couple of millimeters per 100 years. For different rocks, it's really changing changing rates, and we could also calculate the slope retreats based on this. So basically, we could guess about the future landscapes, but haven't come to an indefinite answer.
Are there at this point any questions from the public? You're of course welcome to jump in. You have a question?
Can I just say something?
Yeah, of course, sure.
This is really a weird debate for me because dealing with the Balkans, where yes, monuments are built for the eternity, but they usually survive only 30, 40 years. So, these diamond domes and all this, I mean, it's super. I enjoyed so much, these speculations, but usually the monuments, they are not capable to survive the ideology that built them. So usually you don't need this. So yeah, I think that is also one of the things that you should think about, how to.
But such monument creates ideology of its own. So if it's just standing there all the time.
It's not that simple. Yeah. No. I mean, it's. I think it's super interesting. Think about all these things, but it's weird to project so much into the future. What will happen if we know that monuments usually don't survive, they don't live as long as we do. No,
there's the pyramids.
They are not monuments exactly. No? They are kind of tombs for. What you're planning is something that is more in the logic of the civic monument, and that is a very young phenomenon. We know that only for last 200 or 300 years, which means you have to have kind of a classical bourgeois society that has, this intellectualization, and then decides we should project our values through something like a monument. So it's not necessarily the same as pyramids.
Yeah. Why complicate? Why leave it here? Why don't take it with us to space, to other places that humanity or something that evolves from us, will be there? I was like paralleling this with another artwork, which is Kubrick's Odyssey. I see certain similarities where there you have if you look at it from a certain interpretation that might, or a certain viewpoint that you might interpret that movie or something that's there, there's a point in time where that monument was there, placed there, where there was a shift in let's say an evolution or something. Humanity would come from it. And here is a monument where it's a specific point in time where we kind of can pinpoint plus minus 1 billion years when life on Earth will completely die off, right? So I was thinking, why keep it here? Why don't take it with us, and at the moment where the life stops on Earth, bring it here and place it back. So that was something that I was kind of thinking about when I was listening to all this.
Yeah, that's an interesting take. There's lots of times when I was originally kind of brainstorming the ideas with people, and a few people said, send it to space. It can be a satellite, an artificial satellite, it can be a moon, it can be something, it can be that you don't have to worry about geological processes or erosion. It's going to survive in space for a long time.
And this is...
Yeah, I mean, I know it's not so simple, but that's the basic argument was, in space it'll be easier to maintain something to survive for this amount of time. And it's like, yeah, okay, cool, but it's, the thing is of the Earth. It's about the Earth. It's connected to the Earth. It's about Earth processes. It needs to be present on the Earth at that time. So, but the idea of taking it with us and then putting it back here, that's an interesting suggestion because, okay, it's on the Earth when the thing happens. But I wonder, I would ask whether the premise of us being able to maintain ourselves in space for 2.8 billion years is even more ridiculous than to build a monument that lasts on Earth for 2.8 billion years. I mean, yeah, Earth will be here for 2.8 billion years.
But to have this...
Whether we can survive as a species in spaceship for 2.8 billion years? Yeah, that's more complicated. You know about this.
I mean, you spoke a lot about the externality of the monument, but not much about the internality of it.
Mm-hmm.
And also a question, what happens with the fear? Because if I understood correctly, you want to maintain the fear inside of the monument or not? Just point of departure.
The spheres. They're on the outside.
But they keep the fear inside.
No, it's not fear.
Okay.
Sphere, as in ball.
Sphere.
Well, I mean, fear. No, fear. Fear is a part of it as well.
But that's what I was.
Yeah.
From your child's story, I
Fear. The fear of the sphere.
Yeah.
Fear of the sphere.
So what happens with fear?
Yeah. I mean,
because it's way more fragile than the whole materiality.
It's the weakest part, and there was a lot of. It's a shame that it's a real shame that Nuria can't be here. The material scientist I was working with in the University of Barcelona, because she had some really great ideas about how, the what we call the action material, this polymer that we were working on that would react at the temperature we wanted to in the way we wanted to, is by far the weakest part of it. And so how do you protect it? How do we combine it with other materials so it has the strength necessary, but is also protected? And there's some of that is in the book there. But yeah, having it on. I mean, it would make so much sense to send it to space, because keeping it on here on Earth, it's really vulnerable. But I believe it needs to be here. I believe it needs to bear witness, as
Earth is in space.
Earth is in space, yeah. I mean,
There's no space.
Of course it's in space. But it's, within our space. It needs to bear witness to the procedural process of extinctions. It commemorates the final extinction, but it bears witness to the process of extinction. And the process, there will be, it's not just life is now in a process of slowly dying. There will be mass extinctions, and there will be reflowerings of life, and there will be mass extinctions. This cycle of mass extinction, then a flourishing of new forms of life will happen several times, probably, of lifetime. I mean, for me, it's important that this bears witness. It is bearing witness for all this time until it performs its act.
But at the same time, it's so much. It's actually about our planet, right? So it's about the environment, the world that we inhabit. So somehow it's not something to take out of it and bring it back just to perform. It actually needs to go through all the conditions that the planet actually transforms through.
Exactly.
And for me, like, the interesting part of this project is, which I understand as like this is a first stage, it could involve, it needs so much more layers, of actually research that will help, that are not just like speculations about this deep future, which I totally agree with Beti, and like what you also guys mentioned, that it's so hard to imagine, even like think 2.8 billion years in advance, already 400 years, it's like hard to comprehend. But of course there are like projects that need to plan for longer periods of time, such as nuclear waste disposal, for example. So there are already human-made projects that need to design for long-term future that is like spanning generations. But of course, this is like way, like much more in the future than anything what we are now planning or thinking about. But what is interesting for me at this project is actually that it requires of you and the people that are involved in the research to think about the planet more. So somehow, and the culture that we will share in the future or not. So in a way, I would like to bring the debate back to the present now, and maybe before I give the word again to the audience, maybe each one of you could shortly comment on how do you think, from your field of research, the research that this project involves and needs can help us understand better our present or our community that we live in. Like, what can it actually contribute to the contemporary challenges that we face? Because, of course, climate change in terms of like the ecological and geological perspective is a huge one, but with your project it doesn't matter, right? It's just like everything will go extinct sometime, so why bother? But that's not probably the point, right? You know, that's not I hope it's not the point you want to make. So in a way, researching these transformations maybe can help us understand better something about the world we inhabit today. So maybe if you could, like, each of you, if you have some thoughts to share, what do you think is like the part that could be useful for us now?
So maybe I can start.
Great.
I don't like the silence. That's why I chose. I was thinking about this today. So if we try to, from an engineer's point of view, it has to be something useful to start to build such a humongous object. And if we place it in Creighton-like mineral-rich position, then the building, the construction and the digging out of the sediment and the rocks can help to sustain the current society. So we can get raw materials from it, so we can keep some parts of our life as they are without further damaging of the earth. And then we can also maybe make a layer of this protective dome from the waste that we do. So it's kind of one thing for the other.
But also, you as geologists, you said that we're thinking in millions of years. So your research in general, like, involves thinking about these kind of time scales. Like, it feels so disconnected to our present time in a way, right? So what can we, or like you as geologists talking with Andy about this project, which parts do you see as the ones that are somehow interesting for what's happening today?
Yeah, I think this is an applicable project, but in my view, the most important is the questions that it opened. So the questions that current science don't have the answer on it, and if we as a humanity decide that we want to do something like that, then also science needs to put in the effort to put the answers to these questions that Andy proposes with this project. So in a way, it's not what we currently have from it, but what questions did it open so it can direct the flow of science in the future.
Any comments?
I mean, my comments are different.
Yeah, sure. From your own field.
I cannot only see the value in doing a research of what will the life conditions be in the future or something like that, because I think the project is more about what is important for us as human beings, and making a research and all this rethinking about so seriously about something that at least seems nonsensical. And I think actually that is something that brings then this rich metaphor for what? Actually for humanity doing things wrong. So I think actually the project has to be as it is, with this a bit unattractive form of a monument or something like that, putting it on the earth, not in the space, I think actually this brings this an intense meaning to the project. So, yeah.
And Matthew, what about you? Like, what is this speculative part? How is it relevant? How helps us understand our time better?
Yeah, weirdly, I think the geophysical perspective is like really resonant in a lot of ways, in that like thinking about a project like this that's really ambitious means having to think through a variety of social and scientific systems that we might take for granted in a lot of ways, and kind of push our imaginative capacities beyond where we're typically really comfortable. I think that was one of the things that I really appreciated in the conversations with Andy, that was like, he kept pushing back on like what my scale of thinking about the future was, and that is really helpful for thinking about what the future might entail, even just in our kind of human times of a few generations in the future, that like we're so caught up in the contemporary moment of the next 10 or 20 years, and taking on an ambitious project that like changes the scale of the kind of future that we're thinking about just compels imagination in different kinds of ways. And I think it tests the limits of like the sciences and the social sciences and what we can say about things, and like testing those limits is a really generative project.
Any comments from the audience or questions?
I have one more technical. Is the dome, the shape of it, is it just like an idea, or is it meant to be like, as it is, like resilient to, I don't know, environment like earthquakes? So it wouldn't like break at some point and just implode and like destroy the monument, or is it just like, idea how it should defend it?
The forms that I've chosen are the pyramid and the dome, and they're both. I mean, pyramids and domes have both been used historically as. They're kind of architectural archetypes. The pyramid is symbolic of so much aspiration to raise up to the heavens, or by so many cultures. The pyramid, the people that try and tell us that aliens visited us use the pyramid as an example. The pyramids have occurred in so many civilizations as a symbol within kind of religious settings, monumental settings. Pyramid, it has these really interesting cultural associations, but the pyramid is the most stable way of stacking stones. It's a really practical structure. This is why the pyramid has been so ubiquitous, because it's just the most durable way to build something. So I really wanted to make those references with the pyramid shape. And the dome as well, cathedrals have domes. We look up to the dome, and the dome is symbolic of looking up to this kind of reproduction of the heavens. We see that in kind of sacred architecture around the world as well. The dome is repeatedly, it's a recreation of the heavens, of the skies, but at the same time it's an incredibly resilient, strong structure. So at the same time it's kind of looking at these archetypes that we have that have occurred spontaneously and connectedly around the world, that are both incredibly functional but incredibly evocative architectural forms.
Since you brought the problematic of earthquakes, this is something I do for life, so we did not even go there. So, object of that size, even with what we do now, human activity, we can trigger earthquakes. So building a monument of such size, if we are not lucky enough, we put it close to a fault that we do not know, and we can maybe
trigger an earthquake.
Even a not so big earthquake of magnitude 6, let's say this is something that 100 years ago destroyed part of Ljubljana, can reach the surface, create a rupture, like one side of the ground will go down, the other side will go up, and a mountain cannot sustain this.
Before we finish and you can informally talk with Andy about his show and maybe discuss some more ideas, I would just like to point out that there was an issue of Šum Journal produced in dialogue with the initial concept of the project, and we also have the editors here, Max Valinčić and Tisa Trocha. The thematic issue is models of extinction, so do you guys want to say a couple of words about who is writing for the issue? And
yes, of course. Yes, the title says models of extinction. Maybe the foremost ambition of Šum was to kind of tackle the concept of extinction itself. And I know, like we discussed now, that just thinking about such a project is difficult and it can be done in different ways. I know there was this comment about putting the object in space. So there are different possibilities even with this kind of thinking about physical implementation and all of that. But even the thing that this monument brings about, the concept itself, can be a problem of problematization, of disputation, experimentation, whatever. So different people that we kind of collaborate with this issue kind of tackle the concept itself and try to kind of think about what extinction tells us and how to best approach it. And for example, even just thinking of extinction, it's hard because it's always projected from the current standpoint. And we have all of these problems nowadays. I know when we think about new ethical systems like infinity ethics or this kind of new movement of long-termism or effective rationalism, we see the same kind of problems that thinking on such long scales basically computationally intractable. So not only that it needs from us to radically reformulate our current understanding of ourselves, our society, everything, and not simply on one vector, but on different vectors in a kind of multidimensional sense. But even if we do that, it's basically impossible to project that far. So basically the topic of extinction is repeatedly recurrent, and it retains or gains new meaning at each new kind of historic point or kind of this temporal projection. And maybe just to add this, so for example, in a text by Milan Ćirković, it was interesting how he points this basically like a philosophical fallacy from this Woody Allen movie, where he speaks about this Alvin Gentry fallacy, and maybe I can read just a short passage. So he basically says how because he's an astrophysicist, and in his text he's kind of trying to tackle the concept of extinction and how we can encode information into this kind of radically different radically deep futures and these post-human horizons, and he writes beautifully. As Shakespeare noticed, what's past is prologue, although in the cosmological case the prologue is very brief indeed. The fact that we are living so early in the course of the universal evolution, again the first 0.00001% of the lifetime of our stellar system, should make us pause for breath and perhaps instill some humility regarding our temporal position and epistemic pretensions. Plus, it should arguably motivate us to reassess our research priorities, which have thus far been extremely, staggeringly, flabbergastingly past-oriented rather than future-oriented. And for example, the same thing goes with Thomas Moynihan. For example, the concept of deep time itself is connected to the discovery of radiation, and this was only done in the early 20th century. So basically, the extinction as a concept itself is such an early phenomenon, and it doesn't have a good theory to kind of properly understand and tackle it. And maybe with Šum, we took this as kind of an opportunity for ourselves and to kind of connect with this project to kind of put this challenge to us as well. And because extinction, of course, is highly connected to these new movements in philosophy, for example, speculative realism and this famous book by Ray Brassier, where he kind of prophesizes the same kind of philosophical opportunity with the explosion of the sun or whatever. So we kind of tried to kind of go with the flow.
Lisa, you want to add something?
Yeah, I mean, Max was pretty thorough on the topic in general, so I don't have really much to add. Maybe just on the specific texts, maybe that they are quite diverse in theme and in theme, maybe more in style and approach. And some are like Aeneas' text is a bit more turns towards fiction, like theory fiction. Others are a bit more technical, maybe like Milan Čirković, who Max mentioned, which is really maybe kind of like almost an overview, like an literature overview of how to preserve humanity's legacy, maybe. And on the other hand, Federico Nieto's text, which is maybe a critical look towards inhumanism and like perspectives which can be evolved from that. And maybe those three texts are really interestingly bookended by, on one hand, Thomas Moynihan's text, and on the other hand, Wolfendale and Tim Linward, which is also technically a theory fictional, or maybe rather hard fictional text, hard sci-fi in a way. And those two maybe really in different ways go to the crux of the issue, maybe, which is like value in extinction, or maybe value of existence in different ways. Maybe Thomas Moynihan's text, which is on the surface about the role bugs play in humanity's tackling of our own impermanence, but it's about how we begin to maybe value our existence in a different way in modernity as we become aware of our impermanence. And on the other hand, then Wolfendale and Linward, who interweave like this question of value as a choice at the point of extinction. So I think it's a really interesting accompaniment to the project, and I think there are quite a few parallels, and I hope you get your coffee. And
Thanks. Thanks so much for joining this debate. It was super interesting. Matthew, thanks for zooming in from Helsinki. Thanks everyone for listening. And now, please, the exhibition is open. And enjoy the wine. Thanks so much, and see you in the other room.
Thank you.